Okay, well, I thought I'd have another quick look at Marcus Allen, because Ben was saying, well, you know, he could have meant apparently or allegedly, or you know, some of the things he said. So I thought, okay. And you know, one or two people have commented that I cut the clips of Marcus Allen when he's talking about von Braun and co being the Germans that got America to the moon. They don't know what came after that. So I'm just going to include in this a couple of clips where he's talking about von Braun and co being the Germans that got America to the moon, and another picture that shows Armstrong and Aldrin, and he says this was taken before they even reached the moon. And I don't stop it there, I just let it run a little bit so you can see that he doesn't say allegedly or apparently or, you know, had they have gone, as suggested by Ben Emlyn-Jones. Absolute nonsense, of course. But I think we'll start with a clip where Marcus Allen is, this is from Dreaming Sources, and he's telling us that the Russians and the Americans were cooperating at the time. Now, there was no space race, that was invented by the press, and the Russians and the Americans were cooperating at the time. And this is, this is why, I don't think he actually mentions it in this clip, but this is why he says that the Russians would not have blown the whistle on the Americans. Now, you've got to bear in mind that the Russians were, Marcus Allen doesn't understand this because he doesn't understand the technology, and I might show you a couple of examples of that later on, demonstrating how little he knows about technology. He doesn't know that the Russians would have the technology to listen to the Americans on the moon. They would be able to tell by looking at the radio signals. I could see that they were moving around on the lunar surface. Yeah, he doesn't understand any of that. Probably the Chinese too. Certainly, there's a lot more people other than NASA involved in it. As I said before, the Australians, you know, Jodrell Bank, I think, as well. But anyway, getting back to the point, rambling a bit here. So his stance now is that the Russians would not have blown the whistle because they were cooperating with the Americans at the time. There was no space race, and they were happy to go along with America's lie that they'd landed somebody on the moon. Now, personally, I think that's absolutely preposterous. You know, the Russian national pride. There was a real space race. I've said it before, but you know, if they hadn't genuinely lost the space race, they would have continued, and they would have been screaming that the Americans had faked it. So if the Americans didn't fake it, the Apollo missions are all real. Let's start with Marcus Allen telling us that the Russians and the Americans were cooperating at the time. This is there was no space race. This is something he's introduced later. I'll show you a couple of clips from his earlier presentations from a few years back, before anybody said, you know, the Russians would be pointing out that this was a fake if they'd faked it. And it obviously hadn't occurred to Mr. Allen. So now in his later presentations he incorporates this. There was no space race, they were cooperating at the time, to get around that. And he actually says, I don't know if I can find a clip or not, but he actually says that you know, they wouldn't have blown the whistle because they wanted some gas pipe contract or something sorted out. So absolute rubbish, of course. I would think that Russian national pride would come above all. Now, let's start with Marcus Allen Dreaming Sources telling us there was no space race and that the Americans and the Russians were cooperating, and then we'll go on to a couple of his earlier presentations where he talks about the space race and the Cold War. Okay, let's get on with it. And here is Marcus Allen, Dreaming Sources, one of the Ben Emlyn-Jones productions. Let's see what Mr. Allen has got to say about the space race.
But at the time we made the announcement in 1961, a lot was going on in America and around the world. We had the so-called space race. There was no race. It was a media invention to sell newspapers, basically. America and the Soviet Union at the time were cooperating.
Yes, they were cooperating. Yes, right, right, Mr. Allen. Okay. He's got a very good memory, has he? He's all over the place with this. And remember that Marcus Allen has told us in Ben's Dreaming Saucers presentation that there was no space race. The space race was fictitious. It was invented by the press. Yet here he is. There's another video here. And he's going to be telling us what was going on at the time between the Americans and the Russians.
In the context of its time, we've got the Cuban Missile Crisis, we've got the space race hotting up, a little bit.
We've got the space race hotting up. Do we really? Well, that's what all the. It's only the fake mooning, fake mooning. It's only the fake moon Muppets that have been saying that there was no space race. That it's all fake. That the Americans and the Russians were cooperating. Yet here we have Marcus Allen here saying the space race was hotting up.
Later, we have Kennedy being assassinated. We have the student riots at Kent University. We have the Vietnam War getting particularly nasty. We have Robert Kennedy being assassinated.
Well, I'll just let that run on a little bit so that, again, for context, so you can see that he doesn't say, apparently. Yes, the space race was hotting up, eh, Mr. Allen? Okay, let's have a look at another clip. Okay, well, we've all heard Marcus Allen on more than one occasion. In fact, I include a clip saying that the Russians would not have blown the whistle on the Americans if they knew that the Americans faked the moon landing because they were cooperating at the time. That's interesting because that's not what he says here.
Achievement. And for 20 years after that, I believed it. You know, like you believe. There's no reason not to. There was no nobody saying anything adverse against it. People,
of course they were, because it happened, and the Russians knew that it happened, and the Chinese knew that it happened. They had equipment capable of tracking the entire mission, and there are technical aspects of it that Marcus Allen just does not understand. That the Russians would have had equipment to actually be able to monitor transmissions from the lunar surface. They would have been able to tell they were moving around on the lunar surface.
People were just saying, okay, this is fantastic, this is...
And remember, Marcus Allen, I'll show the clip, but he says, well, the Russians wouldn't have blown the whistle because they were cooperating with the Americans at the time. Really? Now, just listen to this.
Given what America were involved in at the time, which was the Vietnam War, which was getting pretty unpleasant at the time, and the Cold War, which was getting a bit colder than it had been in the past.
Okay. So the Cold War was actually getting a little bit colder than it had been in the past. I'd say that, you know, that what with the Cold War getting a little colder than it had been in the past, and the Russian national pride, I think the Russians would have been screaming with the tops of their voices that it was all fake, if in fact it was all fake. Okay, so just a little bit more to see if it's worth continuing.
Given all the things that were happening, the John Kennedy being assassinated, Robert Kennedy being assassinated, Martin Luther...
No, okay, so I'll just let that run on just a little bit, just so that you could hear that he didn't say that the Cold War was getting colder, apparently. Okay, he said the Cold War is getting colder. Okay, let's have a look at another clip. Okay, now Marcus Allen here is just going to tell us a little bit about the Russian space program, what was going on.
in the centre and slightly to the right of the bottom one. They're just airbrushed out. And the reason they were airbrushed out is because they no longer were alive. The man in the middle, in the top left, is Sergei Korolev, the originator and the driving force behind the Russian space program. He was a G.
Yeah, now, it was all very, very secretive on the part of the Russians at the time. The Americans showed everything they did and they showed their failures, but the Russians didn't. So I haven't actually checked this, so there may very well be some truth to this now. He's going to tell us about these Italian brothers who built a monitoring station, and they were listening to the Russians, the Russian space program, and they were listening to cosmonauts in space before Gagarin. Now, I've actually seen that documentary, and I thought it was really good. I recorded it and I burnt it onto a DVD. I thought that's a keeper, that one, because it really is quite interesting. And I think one of them was a female as well. It's not very pleasant to listen to. You know, she's scared and she's hot and all this sort of stuff, and of course you never hear anything more about it because she's probably burnt up. I think one went off out into space never to return. So there is some truth to what Alan is saying here. As I say, I haven't checked all of it, but how many he says there's quite a few. I haven't checked that, but there is some truth to this part of it.
Genius. On his right is Yuri Gagarin, the man we've all come to think of as the first man in space. No, he wasn't. He wasn't the first man in space. He wasn't even the second or the third. He was the 10th Russian into space.
Yeah, as I say, that's the bit I haven't checked. So yeah, but yeah, it's possible, I would say. There certainly were manned and womaned Russian space flights. I don't know actually if the woman was after Gagarin or not, but there was definitely that sort of thing going on anyway.
And we know that because two Italian brothers, my Italian's not brilliant. There were two Italian brothers. Giulica Cordelia was their name.
Yeah, you don't have to be brilliant at Italian, of course, to say an Italian name.
And they were listening in to the Russian radio transmissions from their orbiting spacecraft. They rigged up some remarkable transmitters. Excuse me, I'll just get my pointer so we can see.
Yeah, okay. And my point here is that Marcus Allen has just said that they rigged up some transmitters. That's not what they did. They rigged up some receivers. This is an indication of how little Marcus Allen understands of the technical aspects of what was going on. You don't listen to someone with a transmitter. So let's just hear that again. So that's 711. Let's try 705.
They rigged up some remarkable transmitters. Excuse me, I'll just get my pointer so we can see.
Yeah. So, as an example of how little Marcus Allen knows about the technical aspects of this sort of thing, they rigged up some remarkable transmitters. They actually rigged up some remarkable receivers, and I think this is this might be a picture of it here. Some VHF Yagi antennas that they rigged up there so that they could listen to what the Russians were doing in space. Okay, with that point made of how little Marcus Allen understands about the technical aspects of what the Utica brothers were doing, let's just see another couple of clips that demonstrate Marcus Allen has absolutely no idea about how any of the Apollo technology works.
That might be on people's lips right now, and one of those is that it wasn't just NASA who were monitoring this particular mission. Apparently, several radio telescopes were actually tracking the craft on the way to them.
Sorry about the sucking noises. I'm I'm sucking on a jelly dinosaur. These things are irresistible.
For example, Jodrell Bank telescope claims to have followed the command module all the way to the moon and the lunar surface.
Radio communication.
It doesn't sound like they're very good at radio communications, does it?
We're intercepting the radio transmission.
I've never seen a radio that can GPS locate where the signal's coming from.
This is just a claim they made. There was a TV program trying to prove that the moon landings were real. One of the few refutations that you guys have ever actually experienced. And also,
what the hell does that mean? Okay.
I'm driving in my car, listening to the radio. Okay. There's no possible way I can locate where that signal's coming from.
So if he's in his car, driving in his car, listening to the radio, there's no possible way he can identify where that signal's coming from. If he was in an aircraft cockpit, he would be able to. You just put a frequency in for a beacon, and the thing will spin round, and it will show you exactly the bearing to the beacon from the aircraft, because you don't need that in cars.
And Ben, one point on that Jodrell Bank tracking. Jodrell Bank were actually using their big 300-foot diameter dish, the one we see in all the pictures. They were using that dish to track the Russian craft, which was also on its way to the moon at the same time as Apollo 11.
I'll check that size. That might be what made me think Parkes was 305 metres. But yeah, I'll check that.
NASA had an office at Jodrell Bank, and they were using their 50-foot diameter dish to track Apollo. And they then claimed to have been able to identify the path that the Apollo 11 lander took as it approached the lunar surface. And they're very proud of their little graph which they've drawn to show when Neil Armstrong took over manual control of the craft and how they landed it on the moon, which is absolute nonsense. Because
well, no, it isn't. What Marcus Allen is talking is absolute nonsense. He's got no grasp of the technology. He has no idea about telemetry. So that anyone looking at the downlink telemetry would see exactly what the astronauts operating the spacecraft are seeing. They'll know what the bearing is, how high it is, what the pitch angle is, how fast it's travelling, what the yaw angle is, what its altitude is. They'll know all that stuff. Marcus Allen is just absolutely clueless with regard to this aspect of it. He's clueless with regard all of it, but in particular this particular aspect of it.
No radar can operate at 240,000 miles to pick up an object 20 foot across and identify its trajectory at that distance.
So he has absolutely no idea how any of this technology works, and I think that's why it was worth putting that other clip in where he was talking about the Italian brothers using a transmitter. He doesn't understand it. He's done very little research on it, they of course were playing around with receivers, and they were listening to the chatter between the Russian spacecraft and the Russian control center. Nothing to do with transmitters. And what he's saying here, what he thinks here is that they were tracking it as a radar, getting radar pulses back from it to be able to determine what it was doing, when in fact they were just looking at the telemetry link, and they would have all the information repeated to them that was on the dashboard in the lunar module, and the same information, of course, would appear at NASA. So he's completely clueless.
It's fiction. The whole thing is complete fiction, but it's part of the whole parable of creating this image of landing on the moon. Well, of course, Jodrell Bank tracked it, and Jodrell Bank are a reputable place, therefore it must be true. No, it's not.
Of course it is, and you really should wear thinner underpants, Mr. Allen, so that we can understand what you're saying more clearly, because you're talking out of your backside.
NASA were telling them what to do. The Federal Bank were far more concerned with tracking the Russian craft, which is what they were employed to do by the Russians, with the full knowledge of the British and American governments.
Yeah, maybe I'll check that.
There was no problem about that. And then we get on this ridiculous story of the ham radio operators who were listening in to the Apollo command module.
I think I actually mentioned this in the previous one, you know, where he says this ridiculous story about the ham radio operators. I'll leave a link to that below. That's all fact. They were listening to the high band VHF link, not the S band microwave link. Again, you know, 2 minutes worth of research would have shown Alan all he needs to know about that. But he's just talking absolute rubbish.
That's another one I heard.
How were they listening when the command module and the lunar module, well, the command module specifically, were transmitting back to Earth, we're told, using the gigahertz frequency?
And with was it 4.5 kilowatts?
Yes, and ham radio operators can only operate on long wave.
Yeah, ham radio operators do very little operating on long wave. Most ham radio operation is done on short wave, and they do a lot of VHF and UHF stuff as well. They do microwave stuff, bouncing signals off the moon and all that sort of stuff. And I did actually show a clip of somebody doing that in the last video. I might even include that clip, or leave a link to it. Below. But what they're saying here is absolute rubbish. And then for Ben to pipe up and talk about, you know, there was only 4 kilowatts available in the lunar module. These guys are not technical guys. They have absolutely no idea how any of this technology works. Saying, oh, 4.5 kilowatts wouldn't be enough. Well, the transmitter power was 20 watts. And they use something called antenna gain to produce a microwave beam back to the Earth. And if you know a bit about it, you know what the transmitter power is, you know what the transmit gain is, the transmit antenna gain is, you know what the receive antenna gain is. That path is quite considerable. You can work out the path loss, and you can work out the expected received signal level. These guys would have absolutely no idea how to do any of that. They are talking absolute rubbish. Okay.
Oh, gigahertz. They don't have the equipment to do it. Again, another fantasy.
Yeah, I think you are the one that lives in a world of fantasy, Mr. Allen. With all this bloody nonsense, talking with authority on things you have absolutely no understanding of. And I think the Apollo 13 thing on the dreaming sources, I think that was a pretty good example, actually, where you stood up the front there and said, oh, have you heard the story about Apollo 13? I bet you haven't heard this one. You know, it came down in the Atlantic, it was recovered by the Russians, and he was speaking with that. You know, he's got quite an authoritative voice, Marcus Allen, which makes people that don't know, aren't in a position to know that he's talking absolute rubbish, because he sort of speaks well and he sounds like he knows what he's talking about. They think that he does, and he doesn't. He hasn't got a bloody clue. Okay, let's just see what else there is here.
By people trying to support this ridiculous deception.
Yeah, the ridiculous deception is being carried out by these fake moon landing muppets. That's where the deception is. If you look at this closely, you'll find that they twist things here and they give something a little tweak there, which sort of gives the impression that they, you know, might not be quite right. But when you actually look at it, they're being deceptive. They're talking rubbish, and they're being deliberately deceptive. And that Scott Henderson is particularly he tends to do that a lot. If you look at some of the ridiculous things he comes out with, but if you look at them closely, they're very easily dismissed.
Glad you brought up the Russians, because this is another issue. Indeed,
oh, here we go. We're going to get to the Russians now.
Well, Kochner's actually mentioned this in the doc.
Now, is that an ad hominem? Ben? His Royal Cocksness. Another ad hominem, is that? Or are you going to say, well, you know, that's pretty harmless, you know, you can have... yeah, calling someone the Royal Cocksness. Okay, because his name is Cox. The Royal Elwyn, what's his name? Emlyn-Jones. It sounds like that's a snipe, I'd suggest.
Not in the same documentary. Yeah, he's so clever. Don't question him. But of course, this was the Cold War. This was the heart of the Cold War. The USA, Soviet Union, locked in this bitter space race. Now, of course, NASA were controlling all the information, as you explained, but there was one other country in those days that had the capability of actually checking what NASA had done on the moon and reporting back immediately if there was any fraud. I mean, today there's 6 or 7 countries, but in those days there was one other. And that, of course, was the Soviet Union. Now, this is a big objection. They're locked in this life or death space race for the control of the world. What happened in the space race happened in the Cold War, it affected everything else. So wouldn't they be the first people to say, oh, look, come on, they're cheating. They're cheating. This isn't fair. Especially when you consider that the KGB had penetrated the Western establishment to such a great degree. We still don't know completely exactly how successful they've been. Some of the spies are probably still alive and hoping they don't get caught. So why on earth didn't the Russians say anything? Because they must have known. They must have done. They also at least suspected, and they'd be able to check it out.
No, they would have checked it out, and they would have found that it was all happening exactly as it was being reported. They would have had the equipment to be able to see that.
Who in Russia would have blown the whistle? Who would?
Anybody and everybody. Anybody and everybody. Anyone involved with that would have blown the whistle. There was a space race. We've already established that. Marcus Allen says, oh, there was no space race. They were cooperating. He's probably going to say it again. This is a later addition to his ridiculous story. You know, he never used to say this because no one had ever pointed out to him before that the Russians would have been screaming about it if it was faked. And he's introduced this new. You know, with science fiction, you know, you can solve any problem with one line of text in science fiction. The one line of text is, well, yeah, they were cooperating. You know, there was no space race. Fiction.
Who would have said it?
Any of them. They just said, my goodness, the Americans are cheating. This isn't a fair race. They just faked something.
Look, there was nobody in Russia who knew the Americans were cheating. Any more than there was anybody in the West knew the Americans were cheating. It's only the research that's been done over the last 50 years.
No, only all the people involved in all the space stuff in Russia, the space agency in Russia that would have been tracking it. They sent the craft to the moon at the same time, more or less, didn't they, to keep an eye on them, so they could actually verify it. And you know, they would have been screaming if the Americans had faked it. Regardless of what Marcus Allen said or says, the Russians would have been screaming.
So we've uncovered the whole story. Now, also, you now have to look at the whole political situation. In the late 1960s, at the same time Apollo was allegedly on its way to the moon, in the late 1960s...
No, they throw in an allegedly.
The Soviet Union, as it was then, were desperately trying to sign contracts for the sale of their natural gas, one of the very few resources they have in abundance, into West Germany, Austria and Italy. The contract was signed by their foreign minister.
Yeah, this is the thing that I was talking about earlier. You know, they wouldn't have blown the whistle because they wanted to sign up someone with their gas pipe.
Andrei Gromyko, in August 1968, for the supply of natural gas.
Well, there you go. They signed the contract in 1968. In August of 1968. So, you know, best part of a year later, they're not going to be able to get out of it, are they? No, it's a case of national pride. This is absolute rubbish. This is just Marcus Allen nonsense. He's just made all this bloody nonsense up. There may have been a gas pipe and they may have signed a contract for it, but it would have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with it. And we've seen earlier clips in this presentation where Marcus Allen says himself there was a space race. The Cold War was getting colder. Suggests to me that relations between the two countries were getting frostier. Don't you think? Yeah, no, this is just rubbish.
It's still the pipeline, that's true.
Now, that is still going on. Russian natural gas is sold into Western Europe, throughout Western Europe, in vast quantities.
Yeah, but you see, the thing is, the Russians can say whatever they like because Europe needs the gas. That's just as true back then as it is today. Yeah, there's nothing to this. It's just bloody rubbish.
Nord Stream 2 is the Baltic pipeline, goes under the Baltic Sea from near St. Petersburg.
Going off at a tangent here, nothing whatsoever to do with moon landings. Yeah, okay, I think we'll stop that there. But I think that was the bit that I wanted to find where they were talking about the gas pipe. Absolutely ridiculous, of course. Nothing whatsoever to do with it. And yes, it wouldn't only be the Russians; it would be the Chinese and anyone else that had the technology. I'm sure the Australians wouldn't have stood by for it. They would have been jumping up and down. The Brits would have said, you know, you can't tell the world you've done it. You know, that's just not cricket, old chap. And you know, the Australians and everybody else. Someone from the Russian Space Agency would have said that you know, it's what we're tracking and what we're hearing and what we're seeing is not matching what we're being told here. And then someone would have folded and said, yeah, you're right. You know, that's not what's going on, either in the UK or China or, you know, anywhere else, Australia. But that never happened because it's all real. It'd be nice actually if they did go up there and you know, to do with this helium-3 mining and take some pictures of high-definition pictures, which, regardless of what Scott Henderson says, you would very easily be able to get back to Earth, of all this stuff on the lunar surface, and it would be very interesting to see what these guys say then. It really would be. All right, I'm going to leave you with a couple of clips just to remind you of what Marcus Allen has said in the past about von Braun and co, being the Germans that got America to the moon. And the other one is Armstrong and Aldrin in the lunar module. Marcus Allen says this was taken before they even reached the moon. Now, just for because people say that you know, I've sort of chopped it off at the end and all that sort of stuff, I'm going to let it run on a little bit so you can see for yourself. After he makes those comments, he doesn't say allegedly, and he doesn't say apparently, or, you know, if they went, they would have been. He says, you'll be able to see it with your own eyes and hear it with your own ears. Von Braun and co were the Germans that got America to the moon, and that Armstrong and Aldrin, picture of those two guys, was taken before they even reached the moon. So perhaps everyone should just email Marcus Allen and ask him why he persists in this fake moon landing bloody rubbish. Okay, I'll leave you with those last two clips. I might tack a bit on the end, but if I don't, I'll catch you next time. Here's just a reminder of what Marcus Allen said. This again is from Dreaming Sources. Said about von Braun and the other German scientists.
America had a new CV paper-clipped onto their visa application, saying that they were good people and they weren't Nazis. They were Nazis. Werner von Braun was a major in the SS. Hermann Oberth was the senior scientist. They were all Germans who got America to the moon. They were all Nazi Germans, which happened. Then you have the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Okay, well, I'll let that run on just a little bit, just so that you could you could see that he didn't say apparently or supposedly, or if they'd actually gone to the moon. He said that von Braun and co. were the Germans that got America to the moon. So I'm really surprised that no member of the audience actually said, you know, excuse me, can I have my 20 quid back or whatever it costs to go and see this guy? Because if they're the Germans who got America to the moon, your presentation is completely pointless, isn't it? From that point on, it's not worth listening to, because he's just said that von Braun and co. were the Germans who got America to the moon. You know, so the whole presentation is about America faking it and not going to the moon, isn't it? I demand a refund, Mr. Allen. I think this one's worth including as well. This is also from Dreaming Sources Marcus Allen. And remember, the moon landing is all fake. Armstrong and Aldrin never went to the moon. It was all shot in a shed in Arizona.
It's a very weird situation. Anyway, here are our heroes. Top one, Buzz Aldrin. Bottom one, Neil Armstrong. And I put it in that format because this was taken from a book bought at the Kennedy Space Center. So it's a NASA publication. And it reads, astronaut Edwin Aldrin inside the lunar module after his moonwalk. That is a lie. If you find the original of that photograph, it was taken before they even reached the moon. He's got his Masonic ring on here, and he's got his sunglasses in his pocket.
Okay, and again, I just let that run on a bit for context. I've used this clip before, but I stopped it as soon as he said this was taken before they even reached the moon. Now, let that run on just a little bit so you could see that he didn't say apparently, if they'd gone, you know, as Ben Emlyn-Jones suggests. So you can see the context for yourself. He's showing a picture, and he was saying that well, the circumstances that the picture was taken is a lie, and that picture was taken before they even reached the moon. Mr. Allen's words. You can see Mr. Allen and hear Mr. Allen quite clearly. And as I say, I just let it run on a little bit because I've used the clip in the past, and I just wanted to let it run on just a tad there for context, because Ben Emlyn-Jones has been saying things like, well, you know, yeah, that's not what he really means, you know. Well, I think looking at that, listening to that, I think that's exactly what he means. He knows they went to the moon. And again, why aren't people demanding a refund? You know, the people that sit in these presentations and watch these people, so that they have such a huge bias blind spot. They're all conspiracy theorists, you know, it has to be rubbish. And they just don't hear these Freudian slips. They don't hear what these people are saying, because this is telling us very clearly what Marcus Allen is thinking. You know, he knows they went to the moon, and he just automatically said, you know, before they even reached the moon. Okay, there is another one on Dreaming Sources. I might chuck that in if I can find it. But if I can be bothered to find it, otherwise we'll just continue on. Okay, so just to show you, just to give you a bit of an idea how signals going from the Earth to the moon and then bouncing off the moon and coming back to the Earth sound, I'll show you a little bit of this. This is I'll leave a link to this video below so you can watch all of it if you want. This is EME, Earth Moon Earth, from the Dwingaloo radio telescope, which I get the impression that's in Europe somewhere. And this guy here is going to be using a piece of ham radio equipment. He's going to be using 120 watts, and he's going to be using the 23 centimetre band. That's the wavelength. The frequency is about 1.2 gigahertz, I think, 23 centimetre band. So this will give you an idea of how how modest. Okay, the dishes are fairly decent size, but the actual radio itself is a very modest piece of amateur radio equipment. You can sort of buy them for a few $100, $1,000 maybe, second hand. But with very modest equipment you can bounce signals off the moon. Now also bear in mind that a very small fraction of the energy that hits the moon comes back. So, you know, if you're on the moon listening to this transmission, it'd really be quite good. And if it was the other way round, these guys are on the moon, the signal on the Earth would be really quite good. But they're bouncing a signal from the Earth, they're generating a signal here with a 120-watt transmitter, they're bouncing the signal off the moon, a very small amount of the energy comes back, and then we're going to listen to the echoes. Or they're going to listen to the echoes, and we're going to watch them listening to the echoes.
It's about news.
We are a completely open and transparent to the public thing, so we have to stay completely within the rules, and that's no problem. It's completely possible because our dish does all the work. At 23 centimeter, the thing has 48 dBs of gain.
Now, this is one of the things that Marcus Allen and co know absolutely nothing about. This chap has just said at 23 centimetres, that's the wavelength, this antenna has 48 dBs of gain. Now, that's a huge amount of gain, and I could show you the RP calculator and calculate the effective radiated power from his 120-watt transmitter. I'm not going to do that, but you know, it's going to be pretty significant. Aid Larson's probably already done that calculation in his head. Or at least he'll tell us he has. Now, the Parkes radio telescope had 64 dB gain, 64 dB of gain on S-band. So a huge amount of gain, huge amount of gain. Again, you know, Marcus Allen, Scott Henderson, they're going to have no bloody clue about any of this stuff.
So we use only 120 watts, but that's enough to produce strong echoes. I will let you know this. Test 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Papa India 9, Charlie Alpha Mike.
So you can hear his echo coming back. You know, the round trip for the radio signal to the moon and back is about 500,000 miles. Radio signals travel at 186,000 miles per second, so the delay is about 2.7 seconds.
9 plus 10. Papa India 9, Charlie Alpha Mike, Dwingelo. But the nicest way to demonstrate moon bounce is...
So that's a ham radio operator. He's probably one of the guys that works there, but a lot of people in this sort of business have ham radio licenses. He's using his own call sign, I suspect there. That's probably not a call sign for the radio telescope, although it might have a ham radio club. It still would need to be a licensed ham operator to be able to be doing what he's doing legally. I suspect that's his own personal call sign.
Vader Jacob, slaapt gij nog? Alle klokken luiden, bing bam bom.
Well, I'll leave that there. I'll leave a link to this video below so you can watch all of it if you want. But that's somebody, an enthusiastic employee, I suspect, giving a demonstration to some people about showing them how you can bounce a signal off the moon with a piece of ham radio equipment and a decent sized dish antenna. Okay, well, let's just go on to the final clip. I'll just have a bit of a look at the Jodrell Bank website and see what it says about the moon landing and wrap it up. Okay, let's have a very quick look at the Jodrell Bank site. Jodrell Bank. Okay, and what do they have to say about this? Oh, well, of course it says 20th of July 1969, Jodrell Bank telescope tracked Eagle lander onto the surface of the moon. I think Marcus Allen is under the impression they were bouncing radar pulses off it. Okay, so from the initial operation of the Lovell telescope, the telescope had become entwined with the space race, tracking spacecraft operated by both the Russians and Americans. Now, Marcus Allen seems to think that they were contracted to track the Russian spacecraft, but I think they were tracking the Russian spacecraft just to see what the Russians were doing. Just as the Russians would have been tracking the Apollo spacecraft just to see what they're doing. So that's what that's all about. I very much doubt they were contracted to, certainly back then, if they were contracted to track, monitor Russian spacecraft, they would have just been doing it because, you know, in the West we wanted to know what the Russians were up to. So, using the big radio telescope at Jodrell Bank. So it's tracking spacecraft operated by both the Russians and the Americans, beginning with the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957. In July 1969, the Jodrell Bank Observatory team, led by the observatory director Sir Bernard Lovell, used telescopes at the Cheshire site, including the Lovell telescope and the 50-foot telescope, now the 42-foot telescope, to simultaneously monitor signals from the Apollo 11 Eagle lander and the Russian unmanned module Luna 15 spacecraft, both on lunar missions. So I think Jodrell Bank was just keeping an eye on Luna 15 to see what was going on. I don't think they were contracted by the Russians to do it. I wonder if you could offer some evidence for that, Mr. Allen. The Jodrell Bank were contracted to monitor Luna 15. I'd be very surprised if that's true. And then it says, signals intercepted, see below, by the 50-foot telescope showed the signals received when Neil Armstrong took manual control. So, so he's right about the 50-foot telescope being used to look at the Eagle. The Eagle lander, as well as the moment when the Eagle lander module touched down on the surface of the Moon. Okay, what this is actually showing is Doppler shift, something called Doppler shift that Marcus Allen will know absolutely nothing whatsoever about. And chart recording signals from Apollo 11's Eagle lander, which were picked up at Jodrell Bank. The graph shows time on the horizontal axis and the frequency of the signal being received on the vertical axis. As the relative velocity between the telescope and the lander changes, the signal being observed is Doppler shifted to higher or lower frequencies. So that's how they were doing it. They were monitoring the Doppler shift on the telemetry signal rather than looking at the telemetry itself. But yeah, they're not bouncing radar pulses off it, so Marcus Allen is completely clueless. Goes on to explain what that means, more or less. It says, meanwhile, and little known at the time, the Russian unmanned module Luna 15 spacecraft was, I'm reading this through the viewfinder again, so apologies for not reading it terribly well. Spacecraft was orbiting the Moon on the day of the Eagle landing with a mission to gather samples of lunar soil and rock to bring back to Earth in advance of the manned Apollo 11 mission. So they couldn't get a man to the Moon, but they thought they'd get a lander there and collect samples and get the samples back before Armstrong and Aldrin could get the samples back. That sounds more like it, doesn't it? Because of the space race, they wanted to get the samples from the Moon. And then they could have said, well, you know, we didn't need to send men to the Moon to get the lunar samples. We've got them here. That's what that's all about. The Jodrell Bank Observatory staff listened in using the Lovell telescope as the Luna 15 unintentionally crash landed on the Moon's surface at 3:50 p.m. UTC on July the 21st, just hours before the Americans lifted off from the Moon's surface and departed. And goes on to explain here, dramatic and previously unheard recordings. The Russian lunar activities were uncovered in archives while Jodrell Bank astronomers were researching material to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the moon landings. Yeah, the recordings were made over 3 days in the control room of the famous Jodrell Bank Observatory, where Sir Bernard Lovell and colleagues were listening to the multiple transmissions coming from the moon. Okay? The recordings were made over 3 days in the control room of the famous Jodrell Bank Observatory, where astronomer Sir Bernard Lovell and colleagues were listening to the multiple transmissions coming from the moon. Sir Bernard Lovell can be heard narrating events with transmissions from the Apollo 11 astronauts in the background. In the recording, Sir Bernard Lovell notes a change in the orbit of Luna 15 to take it closer to the US landing site, and later reports a rumour from a well-informed source in Moscow. They're the people that are going to be shouting and screaming about it, Mr. Allen. Well-informed sources in Moscow that the craft is about to land. People in the control room can then be heard exclaiming, "It's landing! It's going down much too fast." They track Luna 15's final moments before it crashes. The voice is later heard saying, "I say, this has really been drama of the highest order." Yeah, that sounds like something a British person would say, doesn't it? These echoed comments about the US lunar landing made by Lovell on the same day. Comments made by the US lunar landing made by Lovell on the same day in an article, "Greatest Moment of Time," published in the Times on the 21st of July 1969. Now, who in their right mind is going to think all this stuff, all these people are going to be lying about this, and that the well-informed sources in Moscow are not going to be shouting and screaming? So if they took Luna 15 down to get closer to the Apollo landing site, that was to have a look at it, obviously, and get any information they could about it. If it wasn't there, they wouldn't have been able to get closer to it, would they? To try and get closer to it. Yeah. Greatest moments of time. Jodrell Bank Observatory had a crucial role in this historic moment in the space race, monitoring and recording big and small moments of lunar exploration by the Americans and the Russians, as well as independently verifying the US manned lunar landing. Yeah. Okay, so I'm surprised they put that on there, but that's I would say that's probably a later addition for the fake moon landing Muppets, big and small. So the Jodrell Bank Observatory had a crucial role in this historic moment in the space race, monitoring and recording big and small moments of lunar exploration by the Americans and the Russians, as well as independently verifying the US manned lunar landing. Yeah. So they're all lying, are they? They're all lying. Sir Bernard Lovell, all the team, they're all lying. All the people at Parks, Honeysuckle Creek, all lying. Informed sources in Moscow. Perfectly happy to go along with it. Well-informed sources in Moscow. Yes. More than happy to go along with it, even though they sent Luna 15 there to keep an eye on it and make sure it was all happening. Yeah. Put a line through anything you hear from these fake moon landing Muppets. Do yourself a favour. Just forget all about these guys and anything they may have to say about this. It's just nonsense. It happened. All of the Apollo landings happened, just as the history books tell us. And that's the end of it. It's that's the case. Now, there was something else on that ridiculous video of Ben's, something about the Apollo Saturn V not being able to fly, and the Russians going to be looking into it, but I might have a look at that. I might do a video on that, but I'm getting a bit weary of this fake moon landing twaddle. Okay, well I think that'll do. Maybe I'll catch you again.